He thought he could humiliate her in his courtroom, but he had no idea he had just stepped into the one case that would unravel everything he built. The courtroom of Jefferson County stood wrapped in polished oak and quiet authority, sunlight filtering through tall windows and casting long, deliberate shadows across the marble floor as people filled the benches in hushed anticipation, their whispers soft but charged with curiosity, because something about this hearing felt different even before it began. Even before the man at the center of it all took his seat behind the elevated bench, Judge Harold Whitaker, a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the county lines, known for his sharp mind, his iron discipline, and a certain quiet intolerance for those he deemed beneath the standards of his courtroom. His tailored robe falling perfectly as he adjusted his posture with a precision that spoke of years spent controlling every room he entered. And then there was her, seated alone at the defense table, her presence so understated it almost seemed deliberate. A simple woman in a modest beige cardigan, her hands resting calmly over a thin stack of papers, her posture straight but unassuming, her expression composed in a way that didn't quite match the tension humming through the room. Because while others shifted, coughed, or avoided eye contact, she remained still, as if the weight of the moment had no claim over her. Though the murmurs around her told a different story, a few quiet exchanges, a subtle shake of heads, the kind of silent judgment that comes when someone doesn't seem to belong in a place defined by power and protocol. And from across the aisle, a pair of attorneys exchanged knowing glances, one leaning slightly toward the other with a whisper that barely carried but didn't need to. She doesn't stand a chance. And yet, at the bench, Judge Whitaker allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile, the kind that never reached his eyes, because to him, this was already decided. This was not a case to be weighed, but a lesson to be delivered, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of procedure and formality, his intent had already taken shape long before the gavel would strike, long before her name would echo across the room, because this moment had been set in motion days earlier, quietly, carefully, in the kind of calculated silence that leaves no trace until it is too late. And as the clerk began organizing documents with practiced efficiency, the air in the courtroom seemed to tighten, the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself but settles slowly, pressing against every breath, every glance, until even the smallest movement feels amplified. And then, finally, the gavel struck, a single, sharp sound that cut through everything else, commanding attention, demanding silence, and it obeyed, instantly, completely, the room falling into a stillness so complete it almost felt unnatural. And Judge Whitaker leaned forward just slightly, his gaze settling on the woman before him with a measured, almost clinical precision. "State your name for the record," he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying just enough edge to remind everyone who held authority here. And for the first time, she moved, lifting her eyes to meet his, not defiantly, not nervously, but with a quiet steadiness that didn't fit the role she had been placed into. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, each word deliberate. "Emily Carter." And for a brief moment, something imperceptible shifted in the air, a subtle pause, a flicker in the rhythm of the room that no one could quite explain, but it passed as quickly as it came, buried beneath the structure of the proceedings, because Judge Whitaker was already moving forward, already shaping the narrative he intended to control. "Ms. Carter," he continued, his tone now laced with a faint trace of condescension masked as formality. "You are here today under serious allegations, and I trust you understand the gravity of your situation." And a few heads turned toward her, waiting, expecting hesitation, confusion, perhaps even fear, but none came, because she didn't look away. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't fumble through her papers. Instead, she simply nodded once, a small, almost unremarkable gesture that somehow carried more weight than any defense spoken too soon. And somewhere in the back of the room, a spectator leaned forward slightly, as if sensing something just beneath the surface, something not yet visible but undeniably present. Because while the judge believed he was beginning a process, something else had already begun long before this moment. Something quieter, more precise, something that didn't rely on power or position. And as the proceedings continued, one thing became certain. though no one in that room could yet fully understand it. This was never going to unfold the way he expected, and the silence that settled again, heavier now, almost deliberate, felt less like obedience and more like anticipation, as if the room itself was waiting for something inevitable to reveal itself. The clerk's voice continued, steady and procedural, reading through the formal charges with a tone that stripped them of context but not of weight, each word landing with quiet precision across the room. As Emily Carter listened without interruption, her hands still resting lightly on the table, her fingers unmoving as though she had already heard all of this before, while across from her, the prosecution attorney adjusted his tie and stepped forward with a confidence that bordered on rehearsed certainty, his voice rising just enough to command attention as he began outlining the case, emphasizing inconsistencies, suggesting intent, building a narrative that painted Emily as careless at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. And with each statement, a few members of the audience nodded subtly, drawn in by the clarity of his argument, because it was simple, direct, and easy to believe. The kind of story that required no deeper thought, and Judge Whittaker allowed it to unfold without interruption, his expression unchanged, his fingers lightly tapping once against the wood of the bench before becoming still again. A small gesture that suggested patience, but concealed something far more deliberate, because this was the part he understood well, the shaping of perception, the quiet steering of judgment before any real defense could take form. And when the attorney finally stepped back, the silence that followed felt heavier, more expectant, as if the room itself leaned forward, waiting to see how the woman at the center of it all would respond. And for a moment, she did not move, her gaze lowered just slightly, as if considering not the accusations, but something deeper, something beyond what had just been said. And then, slowly, she reached for the thin stack of papers in front of her, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a calm, deliberate motion that seemed almost out of place given the tension surrounding her. And from the bench, Judge Whittaker observed closely, his eyes narrowing by the smallest degree, because there was something in her stillness that did not align with the role he had already assigned to her, something that did not fit the pattern he had seen countless times before, defendants who stumbled, who reacted, who revealed their uncertainty in the smallest of ways. But Emily Carter did none of that, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, measured, yet unmistakably clear. "Your Honor, may I clarify one point before we proceed further?" And a faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but noticeable, because it was not what anyone expected, not in tone, not in timing, and the judge paused for a fraction of a second before nodding once, granting permission with a controlled motion, though the slight tightening at the corner of his eyes did not go unnoticed, and Emily lifted her gaze fully now, meeting his with that same steady composure. "The timeline presented contains an inconsistency," she continued, her words precise, devoid of emotion, yet carrying an undercurrent of quiet confidence. And somewhere in the second row, a man shifted in his seat, glancing briefly toward the prosecution as if to confirm what he had just heard, because this was not the reaction they had anticipated, not from someone in her position, and the attorney stepped forward again, his posture stiffening slightly as he prepared to respond. But before he could speak, Emily continued, not louder, not faster, simply unwavering. Specifically, the documentation referenced at 2:14 p.m. contradicts the record filed at 1:52 p.m., and both cannot be accurate simultaneously. And the room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, but something changed, something subtle and immediate, a shift in the air that could be felt more than seen, as if the structure of certainty that had been so carefully presented moments earlier had developed the smallest of fractures. And Judge Whittaker leaned back just slightly, his expression still composed, but the faintest pause now present in his otherwise seamless control, because in that moment, without raising her voice, without stepping outside the boundaries of respect, Emily Carter had done something unexpected. She had not defended herself. She had begun to question the foundation of the case itself, and the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was attentive, alert, waiting, because somewhere beneath the surface, the first indication had appeared. This was not going to proceed the way it was planned. The faint murmur that had begun only seconds earlier did not grow louder. but it spread, subtle and electric, like a current moving through the room as the prosecution attorney glanced down at his documents, his fingers tightening ever so slightly against the folder in his hand, because what Emily had pointed out was not dramatic, not emotional, but precise, and precision was far more difficult to dismiss. And for a brief moment, he hesitated, just long enough for those watching closely to notice, before stepping forward again with a controlled breath. Your Honor, the discrepancy she refers to is a matter of clerical sequencing, not substance, he said, his tone carefully measured, attempting to restore the momentum he had established earlier, but the confidence in his voice carried a faint strain now, almost imperceptible, yet present, and from the bench, Judge Whitaker's gaze remained fixed on Emily, not the attorney, as if recalibrating something internally, reassessing the woman who sat before him with an unexpected steadiness, because this was not how it was supposed to unfold, not this early, not this quietly, and Emily did not interrupt. She did not react to the explanation offered against her. Instead, she waited, allowing the words to settle, allowing the room to absorb them fully, and when the attorney finished, she spoke again, her voice unchanged, calm, even, but now carrying a subtle edge of direction. If it is only clerical, then the supporting log should reflect that correction, she said. And this time, she did not look at the judge. She turned her attention slightly toward the evidence table, toward the documents that had been presented as unquestionable moments ago. May I request that the original log be reviewed in full sequence? And the request itself was simple, procedural, entirely within the rules. Yet it carried a weight that shifted the atmosphere further, because it was not a defense, it was an invitation to examine. An examination meant risk, and risk was not something Judge Whitaker typically allowed to enter his courtroom without control. And for the first time, his hand moved again, not the composed stillness he had maintained before, but a deliberate motion as he adjusted the papers in front of him, his eyes scanning quickly, searching for alignment, for confirmation, for the seamless narrative he had already accepted. But the pause lingered, just long enough to stretch the silence into something noticeable, something that caused a woman in the third row to lean forward slightly, her expression shifting from passive observation to quiet curiosity, because something was changing, something subtle but undeniable, and the attorney cleared his throat, stepping in once more, his words coming a fraction faster now. Your Honor, reviewing additional logs would only delay proceedings unnecessarily. The documentation provided already establishes. But he stopped, not because he chose to, but because Judge Whitaker raised his hand, a small gesture, controlled yet absolute, and the room fell still again, deeper this time, more attentive, because that gesture meant something. It meant the direction of the case was no longer entirely in the attorney's control, and slowly, deliberately, the judge turned a page, then another, his expression unchanged but his focus sharpened, and as seconds passed, each one heavier than the last, the certainty that had filled the room earlier began to thin, replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, and Emily remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not pressing, not urging, simply present, as if she already understood what the rest of the room was only beginning to sense. And then, without looking up immediately, Judge Whitaker spoke, his voice lower now, more measured than before. The court will review the full sequence. And it was not a concession, not openly, but it was enough. Enough to shift the balance. Enough to signal that something had slipped beyond expectation. And as the clerk moved to retrieve the additional documents, the sound of papers sliding across would echoed softly through the room, louder than it should have been, because in that moment, every small detail carried weight, every movement felt amplified, and somewhere in the back, a man exhaled slowly, as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was holding, because the case that had seemed so straightforward only minutes ago no longer felt certain, and the silence that followed was no longer about authority, it was about anticipation, because piece by piece, without force, without confrontation, Emily Carter was beginning to change the direction of everything. The sound of the additional documents being placed on the clerk's desk carried farther than expected, each page turning like a quiet signal that something irreversible had already begun, and as the clerk organized the files in chronological order, The prosecution attorney shifted his stance, no longer as relaxed as before, his confidence now held together by formality rather than certainty, while Judge Whitaker leaned slightly forward, his eyes moving across the records with a precision that suggested control. Yet beneath that control was a growing awareness that the structure he had relied on was no longer seamless, because the timestamps, once read in isolation, had supported a clean narrative, but now, laid out in full sequence, they told a story that did not align as neatly, and the silence in the courtroom deepened, not empty, but focused, every person present watching without speaking, sensing that this moment, though quiet, mattered more than anything that had been said aloud. And Emily remained exactly as she had been, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly, her gaze steady, not following every page, not reacting to every shift, as if she already knew what the sequence would reveal. And that stillness began to stand in contrast to the subtle tension now visible in others. The attorney clearing his throat again, his fingers adjusting the edge of his folder more than necessary, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of uncertainty. And when he finally spoke, his tone was careful, measured, attempting to regain ground without appearing to retreat. Your Honor, even if minor inconsistencies exist, they do not alter the core facts of the case. But the words did not land the way they had before, because now they sounded like reinforcement rather than authority, like an attempt to hold a position that was no longer secure, and Judge Whitaker did not immediately respond. Instead, his attention remained on the documents, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly as he reached a page that required a second glance, then a third, and for the first time since the proceedings had begun, the rhythm of the courtroom slowed in a way that was no longer controlled by him, but by the unfolding reality in front of him. And then, quietly, almost too quietly for such a moment, he spoke. This entry appears to have been filed after the referenced action, and the sentence was simple, factual, but it carried a weight that settled over the room instantly. Because it was not a defense, it was not an argument, it was an observation from the highest authority in the room, and it could not be ignored. And a faint ripple moved through the spectators, heads turning slightly, eyes shifting between the judge and the prosecution, because that single statement had done what no raised voice could have done. It introduced doubt, and doubt, once present, could not be contained. And Emily lifted her eyes again, not quickly, not dramatically, but with that same steady composure. And when she spoke, her voice remained calm, almost gentle, yet precise enough to cut through the tension. Yes, Your Honor, that is the inconsistency I referred to. And there was no triumph in her tone, no emphasis, just clarity. And that made it more powerful, because it was not about proving a point, it was about revealing a truth that had been overlooked. And the prosecution attorney stepped forward again. But this time there was a hesitation that had not been there before, a fraction of a second that stretched longer than it should have. There may be a clerical delay in the filing system, he said, though the explanation sounded thinner now, less anchored. And Judge Whitaker finally looked up, his gaze moving from the documents to Emily, studying her with a depth that had not been present earlier, because something about her composure, her timing, her restraint, did not match the image he had formed. And that realization, though subtle, began to shift something within him, not visibly, not fully, but enough to change the direction of his attention. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now, more deliberate, it was no longer a silence of authority, but one of recalculation, because without raising her voice, without stepping outside the boundaries of respect, Emily Carter had begun to do something far more dangerous than defending herself. She was exposing the cracks in the very structure that had been built against her, and the room felt it. Even if no one spoke it, the case was no longer controlled, it was unfolding. The weight of that single observation did not fade. It settled deeper, pressing into every corner of the courtroom as the implication of it began to take shape. Because if one entry was out of sequence, then the structure built upon it was no longer stable, and stability was everything in a case that depended on precision. And Judge Whitaker knew that, which was why his silence now carried more significance than any ruling he had made earlier, his gaze returning once more to the documents as if searching for a way to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had already accepted. But the alignment was no longer there, and across the room, the The prosecution attorney stood still, no longer attempting to fill the silence immediately, because even he understood that speaking too quickly now would only expose the fragility of his position, and the spectators, who had once watched with passive curiosity, now leaned into the moment with quiet focus, their attention no longer scattered but fixed, drawn in by the subtle unraveling that was happening without spectacle, without raised voices. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter remained composed, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the shift that was taking place, because she had not interrupted, she had not argued, she had simply revealed, and that difference mattered. And after a few more seconds that stretched longer than they should have, Judge Whittaker finally closed the file in front of him with a controlled motion, not abrupt, not forceful, but deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice carried a new weight, quieter, more measured. The court requires clarification on the sequence of filings. And though the statement was procedural, it signaled something far more significant. It signaled that the narrative presented was no longer being accepted at face value. And that shift did not go unnoticed, the prosecution attorney stepping forward again, this time more cautiously, his tone adjusted, less assertive, more explanatory. Your Honor, any discrepancy can be addressed through administrative review. It does not undermine the intent of the filing. But even as he spoke, the words seemed to lose their footing, because intent without consistency could not stand unchallenged, and for the first time, his argument sounded like it was being constructed in response rather than delivered with certainty. And Emily lifted her hand slightly, not abruptly, not interrupting, but requesting space to speak. And when the judge acknowledged her with a small nod, she continued, her voice steady, controlled. Your Honor, if I may, the issue is not administrative, it is procedural integrity. And the phrase itself carried weight, more than its simplicity suggested, because it reframed the entire situation, shifting it from a minor clerical matter to a question of legitimacy. And a few heads turned again, the subtle movement of recognition passing through those who understood what that distinction meant. And Emily did not rush her words. She allowed them to settle, to be heard fully, before continuing. If the sequence is inaccurate, then the basis for the claim requires reevaluation. And there it was, not an accusation, not a confrontation, but a logical conclusion that could not be easily dismissed. And the room felt it, the quiet expansion of that realization as it moved through the space. And Judge Whittaker leaned back slightly, his expression composed but no longer untouched, because what stood before him was no longer a simple defendant responding to charges, but someone who understood the structure of the process itself, someone who was not reacting, but navigating. And that distinction began to change everything. And for a brief moment, his eyes remained on her, studying, reassessing, as if trying to understand how he had misjudged her so completely. And the silence that followed was no longer heavy with authority, but with something far more uncertain, because the case had shifted beyond control. And without raising her voice, without stepping outside the bounds of respect, Emily Carter had begun to expose not just an inconsistency, but the possibility that the entire foundation of the case had been constructed on something that could not hold. And the room knew it. Even if no one said it, the balance had changed. The air in the courtroom no longer felt controlled. It felt measured, as if every word now carried consequences that could not be undone. And Judge Whittaker remained still for a moment longer than before, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench, not tapping this time, not signaling authority, but pausing, as though recalculating a position that had already begun to shift beyond his grasp. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but the tone had changed, no longer dismissive, no longer edged with quiet superiority, but careful, deliberate. Ms. Carter, are you suggesting that the procedural integrity of this filing is compromised? And the question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a turning point, because once asked, it demanded an answer that would move the case beyond its original frame. And Emily did not hesitate. She did not rush. She simply lifted her eyes to meet his with that same unwavering calm. I am suggesting, Your Honor, that the sequence of events does not support the claim as it has been presented. And her words were precise, measured, each one placed with intention, not to provoke, but to clarify. And that clarity carried weight, because it did not rely on emotion, it relied on structure. And structure was what the courtroom respected above all else. And a faint shift moved through the spectators again, quieter now, more focused, because what they were witnessing was no longer a defense. It was a dismantling, piece by piece, without force, without resistance. And the prosecution attorney stepped forward once more, but this time his movement lacked the confidence it once held, his posture slightly tighter, his voice more controlled than commanding. Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to reinterpret procedural details in a way that distracts from the core issue, but even as he spoke, the phrasing sounded less certain, because the core issue itself had begun to blur, and Judge Whittaker did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on Emily, studying her with a level of attention that had not been present at the start of the proceedings, because something about her responses, her timing, her restraint, suggested a depth he had not anticipated, and for a brief moment, the room held its breath, not out of fear, but out of anticipation, because everyone could sense that something more was about to surface, something beyond inconsistencies, something that would redefine what this case truly was. And then Emily moved, not abruptly, but with quiet purpose, her hand reaching for a single document within her stack, one that had remained untouched until now. And as she placed it gently on the table, the soft sound of paper against wood seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye toward it. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a subtle shift, not in volume, not in tone, but in direction, as if the conversation itself was about to change course. Your Honor, if the court permits, I would like to reference an additional filing that has not yet been considered in this sequence. And the request was simple, procedural, yet it carried an implication that extended beyond what had already been discussed, because an additional filing meant additional context, and additional context meant the possibility that what had been presented so far was incomplete, and Judge Whittaker's expression remained composed, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in dismissal, but in focus, as if recognizing that the path ahead was no longer linear. And after a brief pause, he nodded once, granting permission, though the weight of that decision settled immediately across the room, because it signaled that the case was no longer confined to its original boundaries. And Emily lifted the document, not displaying it dramatically, not drawing attention through movement, but allowing its presence to speak for itself. This filing, she continued, was submitted prior to the entry in question, yet it has not been included in the sequence presented. And for the first time, the silence that followed felt different, not just attentive, not just tense, but expectant in a deeper sense, because if what she said was true, then the inconsistency was not isolated, it was systemic. And the prosecution attorney's expression tightened, his gaze shifting quickly toward the documents as if searching for confirmation or denial. But the hesitation was already visible, and Judge Whittaker leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged now, no longer observing from a distance, but entering the complexity that had been revealed. And as the clerk moved to receive the document, the room fell into a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if every person present understood, even without speaking it, that the case had crossed a threshold, and whatever came next would not simply challenge the details, it would challenge the foundation itself. The moment the clerk's hands received the document, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time it was unmistakable, no longer subtle, no longer uncertain. It was a quiet recognition that something critical had just entered the record, and as the paper was placed carefully among the others, its presence alone seemed to redraw the boundaries of the case, because this was no longer about a single inconsistency. It was about omission, and omission carried intent, whether acknowledged or not. And the prosecution attorney stepped forward immediately, quicker than before, as if trying to intercept the direction this was taking. Your Honor, this document has not been previously introduced because it is not relevant to the matter at hand, he said, his voice firm but no longer effortless, and the slight increase in pace betrayed the pressure building beneath his composure. But Emily did not respond to him. She did not turn her attention toward his interruption. Instead, her focus remained on the bench, her posture steady, her voice calm when she spoke again. Respectfully, Your Honor, the relevance becomes clear when the sequence is examined in full. and there was no confrontation in her tone, no attempt to overpower, only a quiet certainty that drew attention. Not to her, but to the structure she was revealing. And Judge Whitaker did not interrupt this time. His gaze fixed on the document now in front of him as the clerk opened it, the sound of the page turning echoing softly in the otherwise silent room. And as his eyes moved across the contents, something changed, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough to alter the rhythm of his stillness. A pause that lasted longer than expected, a second reading where one should have sufficed, and then a third. And the room felt it. That shift, that moment when authority meets something it did not anticipate, and no one spoke, not the attorney, not the spectators, because everyone understood that this silence was no longer procedural. It was consequential, and Emily remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly, her gaze steady, not pressing for reaction, not filling the space, because she did not need to. The document was speaking now, and finally, Judge Whitaker leaned back. Slightly, his expression composed but no longer untouched, his voice lower, more deliberate when he spoke. This filing indicates prior acknowledgement of the matter in question, and the statement, though measured, carried weight that settled instantly across the room, because it introduced something that could not be easily dismissed. Prior acknowledgement meant awareness, and awareness meant responsibility, and the prosecution attorney's posture stiffened, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward again, though this time the confidence was no longer leading, it was following. Your Honor, that acknowledgement was preliminary and does not alter the validity of the subsequent filing. But even as he spoke, the explanation sounded thinner, stretched against the growing clarity of the sequence now unfolding, and Emily lifted her eyes once more, her voice calm, precise, yet carrying a subtle shift that marked the moment as something more than continuation. If it was acknowledged prior, then the later filing cannot establish the claim as new information, she said. And there it was, not louder, not sharper, but undeniable. The kind of statement that did not argue. It concluded, and the room did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, a deeper, heavier silence that settled like weight across every seat. Because the implication was clear, the foundation of the case was not just flawed, it had been presented in a way that obscured its own timeline, and Judge Whitaker's gaze returned to her, not with dismissal, not with authority, but with something else, something closer to recognition. Because the woman he had expected to navigate confusion had instead navigated the law itself with precision, and that realization could not be undone. And for a brief moment, no one moved. No one spoke, because the balance had shifted beyond recovery, and the quiet certainty that had once filled the room had been replaced by something far more powerful, the undeniable presence of truth emerging piece by piece. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter remained still, not triumphant, not reactive, simply composed. As the structure around her continued to give way, the silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the courtroom with a weight that could not be ignored. Because what had just been revealed was no longer a matter of interpretation, it was structure, and structure did not bend easily once exposed. And Judge Whitaker remained still for a moment that stretched longer than any before it, his gaze fixed not on the attorneys, not on the spectators, but on the documents laid out before him, as if they now carried more authority than the proceedings themselves. And when he finally moved, it was deliberate, his hand closing the file slowly, the sound soft but final, echoing faintly across the polished wood. And every eye followed that motion, because it signaled something none of them had expected when the hearing began. And when he spoke, his voice carried a gravity that had not been present earlier, no longer elevated by control, but grounded in acknowledgement. The court finds that the sequence of filings presents a material inconsistency that directly impacts the validity of the claim, and the words landed without force. Yet they carried more impact than any argument made before them, because they did not persuade, they concluded, and the prosecution attorney stood motionless for a fraction of a second, as if recalculating what remained of his position, but there was nothing left to reinforce. The structure had already given way, and he attempted one final step forward, his voice measured but undeniably restrained now. Your Honor, if given the opportunity, we can provide clarification. But he stopped, not by interruption, but by the absence of space. because the moment had already moved past him, and Judge Whittaker raised his hand once more, not sharply, not forcefully, but with a quiet finality that required no explanation, and the room fell into complete stillness, deeper than before, because this was no longer anticipation, it was resolution, and Emily remained where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the outcome was not something she had been waiting for, but something she had already understood, and that stillness now carried a different meaning, no longer unnoticed, no longer underestimated, but recognized, and the judge's gaze shifted toward her once more, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with something that resembled respect, though it was never spoken, and then, carefully, deliberately, he continued, "The court cannot proceed on a foundation that does not meet procedural integrity," and the sentence, simple in its wording, closed the path that had been built against her, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through the quiet exposure of truth, and across the room, the reaction was not loud, it was restrained. A collective stillness that held more weight than any outburst could have, because everyone present understood what had just occurred. A case that had seemed controlled, directed, almost predetermined had been dismantled without force, without resistance, and the authority that once defined the room had been reshaped by something far more enduring, and the prosecution attorney lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of a position that could no longer be maintained, while a few spectators exchanged glances, subtle, quiet, as if confirming what they had just witnessed, and at the center of it all, Emily Carter did not react. She did not move to claim the moment. She simply gathered her papers with the same calm precision she had shown from the start, each movement unhurried, unaffected, and that restraint carried its own power, because it made the outcome feel inevitable rather than earned, and as she stood, the faint sound of her chair moving against the floor seemed louder than it should have been, drawing every eye once more, not because she demanded attention, but because she had changed the room without ever asking for it. And Judge Whittaker watched her for a brief moment longer, as if recognizing something he had failed to see before, something that could not be undone now that it had been revealed. And as the silence settled once more, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolved, the lesson lingered unspoken in the air, not delivered, not declared, but understood by all who had witnessed it. The courtroom did not erupt when the decision settled. It absorbed it, quietly, completely, as if the space itself understood that what had just occurred was not meant to be loud, but lasting. And for a moment longer, no one moved, no one spoke, because the weight of it lingered in the air, not as tension, but as realization. And Emily Carter stood with her papers gathered neatly in her hands, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if she had simply completed a task rather than altered the course of an entire proceeding. And that calm carried through her every movement as she stepped away from the table, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble floor, each step measured, unhurried, and yet every eye in the room followed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it without ever asking. And near the back, a man who had earlier leaned forward now sat still, his gaze fixed in quiet reflection, while a woman beside him exchanged a glance with another spectator, their expressions no longer curious, but thoughtful, as if something deeper than the case itself had just been revealed. And at the bench, Judge Whittaker remained seated, his hands resting against the wood, his posture still upright, still controlled. Yet there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable, because the certainty that had once defined him had been replaced by something more measured, more aware. And as Emily reached the aisle, he spoke once more, his voice carrying across the room, not loudly, not with authority, but with a deliberate clarity that drew her to pause. "Ms. Carter," he said, and for the first time, there was no edge in the way he addressed her, no trace of dismissal, only acknowledgement, and she turned. Slightly, not fully, just enough to meet his gaze again. And in that brief moment, the distance between the bench and the floor felt smaller than it had before, because whatever hierarchy had existed at the start of the hearing had shifted, not visibly, not formally, but undeniably, and the judge held her gaze for a second longer before continuing. "The court appreciates the clarity you have brought to these proceedings." And the words were simple, restrained, yet they carried a weight that extended beyond courtesy, because they marked a recognition that had not existed before. And Emily did not respond with words. She simply inclined her head once, a small gesture, respectful, composed, and then she turned again, continuing toward the exit, her figure moving steadily through the quiet room until the doors opened and closed behind her with a soft, final sound. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence settling again, not heavy, not uncertain, but complete, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to what had just unfolded. And the prosecution attorney remained where he stood, his posture no longer rigid, no longer asserting control, but still reflective, as though the outcome had shifted something beyond the case itself. And Judge Whitaker lowered his gaze briefly to the documents before him. The same pages that had once seemed definitive now resting without authority, their meaning altered by the sequence they could not sustain. And when he finally looked up again, the room felt different, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood, and no formal statement followed. No extended explanation, because none was needed. The lesson had already taken shape, quietly, precisely, through action rather than declaration. And as the spectators began to rise, their movements slow, their conversations hushed, there was a shared awareness that they had witnessed something uncommon, not a dramatic victory, not a confrontation, but a restoration, a moment where composure, knowledge, and quiet strength had reshaped the balance of power without force. And long after the room began to empty, the echo of that stillness remained, not in sound, but in understanding, because that day, without raising her voice, without stepping outside the bounds of respect, Emily Carter had reminded everyone present that authority alone does not define truth, and that the strongest voice in any room is often the one that never needs to be raised.